Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again, that if you do feel so inclined, throughout the show, you can do one of two things to contribute and interact with it. You can either press that $ in the chat box in the comments section, leave a tip or donation, or you can leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns in that chat box right there, and I will address them on the show. Great way to get your opinions out there. I love hearing them as well. It just makes the show that much better. Without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of the day here in the show. It is our NFL Fantasy Stars of the Week, Week 10 of the NFL season. Certainly one of the more interesting concerning a fantasy perspective of things. Definitely not the best of performances outside of perhaps that very exhilarating Bengals-Ravens game on Thursday night. However, there were some notable ones that I do want to point out and congratulate these players on. And to start it off, I actually have to make a personal apology to this certain player. So without further ado, let's hear that side of it. See who it is that I'm apologizing to. It's at a quarterback position. This was a guy who was very low on this week. He was on my sits list Friday, and I really did not think that he would show up, albeit against a very weak pass defense of the Atlanta Falcons. But he proved me wrong the only way he knows how, by throwing the deep ball, and he got an upset win, big win for the Saints in Darren Rizzi's first game. Nobody beats the Riz as the interim head coach for the Saints. It's Derek Carr, who of course I am talking about, 16-25, 269 yards, 2 touchdowns, 20.46, and I have to say, I am sorry to Derek Carr for doubting him in this game. I felt like, this was going to be one of those weird NFC South games where it's going to be a defensive slugfest, neither offense can get it going, but Derek Carr proved that potentially the Saints still have some magic left in him. He still has the deep ball, and despite the fact that he has a rash of injuries to deal with in that receiving core, he made big plays, and the Saints defense did what they had to do against, I'm telling you, a pretty stagnant Falcons offense. And so that's why, somehow, some way, the Saints got this upset victory. So kudos to Darren Rizzi and kudos to Derek Carr for pulling this one out of the hat. It was a fascinating game to watch, certainly helped by a couple of Young Hui Koo missed field goals, of course. But it was still a performance I had to reward. Even though there were some quarterback performances out there that were super stellar. I'm looking at you, Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson, that I could have included, but I wanted to include a Sunday guy, and why not include a guy who I doubted all week long. Now, the running back position, Chuba Hubbard. How about him for Carolina? He's making us think Jonathan Brooks who right now. And that's probably the reason why we haven't seen Jonathan Brooks this season, even though he projects to be pretty healthy at this point and could have come back a little bit sooner than right now. So, Chuba Hubbard, though, let's talk about how he's kind of reinvigorated this Carolina offense along with Bryce Young. In Germany, 28 carries, 153 yards, 1 touchdown for a total of 24.9 fantasy points. Overall, a fantastic all-around game for this Carolina Panthers offense. Just really efficient, complimentary football. Didn't necessarily do too much to kind of say during this tough stretch they'll win even more games, but it's still a step forward for this group. And not for nothing, even though it was against a fellow 2-7 team in the New York Giants, it's a confidence booster, right? Because the Carolina Panthers had not won consecutive games in quite some time. And so this one felt like an overall victory that just felt good in a foreign atmosphere, nonetheless, for this unit. And Chuba Hubbard's a big part of that. Through his play, I feel like this offense has gotten more relaxed. The line play has steadily improved with all these run looks that they're getting. And overall, Bryce Young, looked the most confident he's been in his entire career. So kudos to the Carolina Panthers, Chuba Hubbard, and why not throw in Bryce Young as well for kind of building this momentum, even though it might not last because they have a tough stretch. But for now, let's revel in the fact the Carolina Panthers have consecutive wins for the first time in forever. Then, at the wide receiver position, this is where it gets a little tricky. Not many good or fantastic wide receiver performances this weekend. We have to go all the way back to Thursday night and Ja'Marr Chase's 55-point outburst in terms of a solid wide receiver performance. But if we're looking for just a decent one that I felt got the job done, it's very impressive in this big victory over the Washington Commanders. George Pickens made a lot of great catches, one of the best contested catch receivers in the National Football League, including that acrobatic catch in the back of the end zone for the first touchdown of the day for Pittsburgh. Huge reason as to why I feel this Pittsburgh Steelers offense is just getting scarier and scarier week by week. It just brings out the best in Russell Wilson, and it just brings out the best in this offense. Because if you have to respect the deep ball, you can run it as well. And Najee Harris has been one of the best running backs ever since Russell Wilson was inserted into the squad. And so this complementary style of offense is one that seems unusual to the Steelers, but unique in that perhaps nobody expected Russell Wilson to be able to unlock this Pittsburgh Steelers team. Because yes, George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth were good building blocks for this team, and no one expected them to be complete stars. But I feel like with this new look offense, they really are becoming not just a fascinating real-life team, one of the AFC contenders, but a really nice-looking fantasy team. Because of what Russell Wilson brings to the squad. He can either throw it deep, and you can get good fantasy production from guys like Pickens and now Mike Williams, or you can get production from Najee Harris for all the holes that open up in the run game with the downfield passing game. Just a fascinating offense to observe, and I have to reward George Pickens for his part in it, because even though you're not a prototypical wide receiver one, he is one that stretches the field, and as long as Russell Wilson is comfortable throwing that deep ball, one of his best traits, it's something that has to be monitored in this Pittsburgh offense, especially if you're a fantasy football manager and you have a Steelers player on your roster. Because the Steelers' schedule is only going to get tougher. And this performance by Pickens is very noteworthy because the Commanders' secondary, yes, potentially not one of the better ones they'll face all year, but still perhaps a solid litmus test for this offense. And to see this performance from Pickens gives me hope that against the Steelers in a couple weeks' time, that this Steelers offense will be primed and ready to go. And plus, that's one of the weaknesses of this Ravens team. And if they're going to win the AFC North, they're going to have to exploit that weak Ravens secondary. So look for George Pickens' name to show up on this list a little bit more often as we conclude this NFL regular season. Then the last player who I want to acknowledge, one of the bright spots for the Falcons in a pretty inept offensive performance, Bijan Robinson. 20 carries, 116 yards, 2 TDs, 29.4 points. And this game kind of felt like the finally game, where Bijan finally proved to be a better running back in the system than Algier, because Algier, all year long, had looked more effective in the Falcons' run game than Robinson. But this game proved to be Robinson's show-out game. But unfortunately, for the Atlanta Falcons, it's been one of those offenses where you get performances from unexpected players, but then your stars don't deliver. But then when your stars do deliver, your unsung heroes kind of fall flat, and then you're in the cycle of win convincingly, lose inexplicably. And so these past couple of games have really proven how hard the Falcons are to gauge right now, because they have some interesting wins, right? They've already had 2 wins over the Bucs, putting them in prime position to still win the NFC South, should the Bucs make a nice deep playoff run or NFC South run once Mike Evans comes back. But they have shown they are a flawed team, especially on the offensive end. but the X factor can be Bijan Robinson. Because think about this. Kirk Cousins, for as effective as he's been over these past couple of weeks, he is still a quarterback who does not inspire me in terms of creating out of structure. And I've seen him because a lot of times my dad is a Vikings fan, and all those primetime games he was on where he would just be so frustrating to watch in terms of when he gets pressured, just collapsing under the pressure. How it translates to this Falcons team is sometimes a little bit noteworthy, because you would think that in order to fully get the best out of this talented crop of players that the Falcons have at their disposal, and young ones at that, you would want a guy who can create a structure and not just either game manage or work the short to intermediate areas of the field. Because right now, what good defenses or defenses that can at least generate pressure are doing is just setting the house against Kirk Cousins and forcing him to try and create a structure which he can't do. And I still think it's because of the lingering Achilles injury, but this is a team that had very lofty expectations coming into the season. And to tie that much money into him, $180 million, into Kirk Cousins for this team to succeed is a lot on someone who's proven that, yes, he can be efficient enough to lead you to the playoffs. But if you want to make a deep playoff run, as I feel the Falcons do, then you need to figure out how to move him around. Because you can't just sit that back there like a sitting duck and get beat up in the playoffs. And even against teams like the Saints, who should not have won this game because they are a highly inferior team. But in that game, you saw the flaws of what this offense is doing. They rely on trying to keep it close too often, and as a result, they find themselves scrambling to come back in certain situations, much like they were Sunday. And so that's why I feel like Bijan Robinson needs to continue to be an X factor for this team, and that's why this is a noteworthy performance, and it's potentially a sign of things to come for this Atlanta Falcons offense. Let me know what you think in the comments. But coming up next, we transition from the NFL to college football, talk about some of the big names, performances from this past weekend in college football action. We'll be right back to talk about it right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports